Hello. This is my third time trying to do this intro. The first time, it took way too long.
Hell no.
And the second time, I somehow deleted the file. So hopefully I don't somehow mess up this one. As the title says, I'm going to be showing you new players how to possibly improve the characters you get at the beginning of the game. Do not worry, I'm not going to be spoiling anything. I've made sure not to involve anything outside of Mondstadt or anything that's shown after the very first Archon quest. So I won't be shown any of the later areas. So before we get into the specifics of how each character works and how to build each one separately, I'm going to quickly explain how each of them work as a team. So as you can see here, I did a quick list of who I feel goes into main DPS, sub DPS and support. For clarity, when I say main DPS, I mean characters who are almost always on the field for combat, and they're of course doing the main damage. And then sub DPS are characters who do a bit of extra damage, typically while the main DPS is doing their damage. So you'll switch to this character, use their skill or burst, and then swap back to the main DPS, or maybe another sub DPS or support. And then by support, that just means a shielder or a healer. Now, as you can see, of course, from the list I put here, there's no main DPS. So because of that, it means we're gonna need one of these being the main DPS. Now, out of these, and then for support, of course, we have Noelle, who has a shield, and then Barbara, who heals. So, out of these, Traveler could technically work as a main DPS. However, I feel like it's not good enough for a main DPS. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are people out there who use Traveler as a main DPS and, have absolutely cracked out characters. Amber doesn't really work apart from physical amber, which you may or may not have heard of before, which is basically where their main damage is from dealing physical attacks. And that just means she's not actually really dealing any pyro damage, it's instead just charged attacks before they turn into pyro ones. Like, out of the starter characters, Traveler, Amber, Kai, and Lisa, I feel like Lisa actually has the best potential for a main DPS. And then for support, Noelle, who in my opinion actually has the best potential as a main DPS. You could easily use her as a main DPS. So going by what I've said here, the most logical main DPS to use is actually Noelle. And because of Noelle's shield and healing capabilities, it also means you don't need Barbara in your team. So that leaves your main DPS is Noelle, and then we'll have 3 sub DPSs. Now, with the sub DPS, the best thing to really consider is the elements. Now, Geo, which is Noelle's element, as of right now, unless you have Narvia, there's no point having Geo reactions because it is just crystallize. Now, crystallize, all it does is give you a little shield that basically protects you against the element it reacted with. And so the reason why it's different for Narvia, for example, is because her ability uses those crystallized reactions. Apart from maybe a few now that I think about it. But overall, crystallize isn't the thing to go for unless there's new Geo characters who really benefit from it. For Noelle, you want to basically think about the elements between sub DPSs rather than how it goes with the main DPS. There is also another option, which can be better if you're more focused towards elemental reactions, which is actually just have no main DPS. If we instead had Lynette on the team and not Noelle, then we could have some sub DPSs. Okay, so this is roughly what I have. Now, of course, this isn't how I feel about these characters. Like, I feel like some of them would be in a different position normally. But this is just me thinking about you as a new player. So, Xiangling, considering everything about her, an S for sure in terms of abilities. She is just very good. I personally don't actually use her, but I know she is good. These three I put in A. First of all, I actually use Kaeya in the Spiral Abyss as of right now anyway, like just for one of my main teams. So I know that he is very useful just for, you know, cryo application. Noelle, as I've explained previously, she both shields and heals. Unfortunately, Geo doesn't really work, as I've explained before, but regardless, she is still good. Lynette, personally, I feel like it's probably a bit of bias, if I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to deny that I found Lynette quite fun back before, so I'm probably just saying that she's good. But from experience, she's pretty decent. A lot better to use than Animo Traveler, that's for sure. Because little dash thing means she can move about fast, she can get to the enemies quick, and her burst can combine with other elements to then do that elemental damage. It's not just Animo damage that her burst does, technically. And then Collei, like I said before, I haven't used her, so she could actually be up here, or she might be down there. I wasn't really too sure about Lisa, to be honest, but I do know that there is actually a bit more to her skill than what it seems like. Of course, there's the tap in, there's the hold in, and then when you tap 3 times, I believe, the hold skill then does even more damage. I'll probably explain that a bit more. That probably sounded really confusing just now. Then Barbara. Now, of course, Barbara's a great healer. However, taking into consideration whether you should choose her over, like, you know, Noelle, for example, it's a bit hard to say. This team right here, Collei, Lisa, Barbara, let me maybe put in, like, Kaeya as well. That is a solid team. That's like a Hyper Bloom Frozen team. I don't know what that's called. I'm sure that has a specific name, but that's a good team right there. However, of course, I'm also trying to take into account the fact that you might not even have a lot of these characters at the top here. So, you know, it's hard to say for sure. And then I put Traveler down here because, in a way, the Tornado can actually work badly against you. Because imagine you're trying to get to an enemy, you use the burst, and now you have to run after that character. And then I put Amber at the bottom tier just because her burst doesn't really work as a sub DPS. It just does that pyro damage and then it's gone straight away. Her skill takes a while to activate, and unless you have her leveled up tons, the skill doesn't really do much from what I remember, like in terms of damage. So it's kind of hard to say if that's actually good compared to someone like Xiangling. Like if you have the choice between Amber and Xiangling in your party, if you're going for, you know, power, Xiangling for sure. I imagine anyone watching this who understands these characters better than I do would probably say something completely different in terms of this tier list. So you may be thinking, oh, this is great and all, but how can I get each individual character strong? So, for Traveller, the weapon I use personally is Sacrificial Sword, and that is arguably one of the best ones for them. You could also do Favonius Sword. And also, as you can see here, the NG Recharge substat is actually the same amount for both of these swords. So the only thing that matters is the extra thing here, it says below. However, of course, I understand that with all of these characters, if you're brand new to the game, you'll probably only have 3-star weapons right now at the very best. So one weapon you might have early on is also this one, which you can get from an adventure rank reward, I believe. And this one's okay, but it's mainly for a main DPS character. So if you're using Traveller for main DPS, it can be good. However, do bear in mind it only buffs your physical damage, meaning just your regular attacks. That does not improve your attack on, you know, using your skill or burst, apart from the extra attack percent it says here. Now, of course, for 3-star weapons, I had a look around, and the best one I could find was this one, the Harbinger of Dawn. Now, of course, mine is refinement rank 5 here, so the blue number you see here is probably half at refinement rank 1. Now, if you don't know, refinement ranks are basically when you can combine them together to go from rank 2, for example. If I added these two together to it, I then go up to rank 4. And rank 5 is the highest, as you might have guessed. And yeah, it only changes the blue numbers you see down here. So, like I said, for Harbinger of Dawn, it's quite a good one just for, you know, getting crits. So as you can see here, the substat up here is crit damage. Now, as you level up a weapon, that value will go up. And also, as long as you keep yourself healed and not lose much health, you do also get an increasing crit rate. Now, if you're wondering the kind of crit values you should go for here, it's usually a general rule that people say to try and go for about half the crit rate of the crit damage. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to every character because not every character is really used for their attacking. If you took Barbara, as I'm going to explain later on, you don't really use her for hitting crits. You use her for the healing. Now, for artifacts, of course, I don't expect any of you to have this artifact set, the Noblesse Oblige. This one is very good on Traveller because it basically means the burst is more powerful and using it buffs all of the other party members for some time with the attack. However, despite that, the stats are still the kind of ones you should aim for. So for Traveller here, first of all, the main stat up here is always the same for Flowers and Feathers. It is always flat health and flat attack. The substats are the ones that make it better. For a Traveller, the best ones would be crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, and energy recharge. However, of course, attack percent is also a very good one. So if you get any of those, perfect. If you don't worry at all. What really matters at this kind of stage is just anything that makes your character stronger for what you use them for. And yeah, like I said, a similar thing with Feather. Just try and keep the same kind of substats you do for Flower. And then Sands, Goblet, and Circlet are where things change. This is assuming your Traveller is going to be used for sub DPS. So in the sense that you're mainly just using them for skills or burst. You either want energy recharge or elemental mastery. Of course, if you're going for main DPS Traveller with the prototype Rancor, then feel free to use an attack percent instead if you want that kind of physical Traveller build. But again, you kind of just want to go for energy recharge or elemental mastery and then try and go for good substats. Again, don't worry. Personally, I don't have good artifacts on Traveller, so if they're mine or worse than this, then don't worry at all. The main stat is the one you should focus on for now. Or the set, of course. And then for Goblet, attack percent or animo damage bonus is usually the best one to go for here. Now for Goblet, attack percent, if you're going for one of those physical Travellers again. Or you could go for Elemental Mastery or Energy Recharge again if you're going for a more sub-DPS kind. And then for Circlet, again I've done attack here, but you could easily do crit rate, crit damage, or Elemental Mastery. Now of course, depending on what stats your character has, there's usually a better one to go for. For example, if you don't have good energy recharge, and this one was elemental mastery instead, then you should probably go for an energy recharge instead. And so for artifacts, this one is a very good one, very solid for Traveller overall. However, another good set to go for is the Exile. This one is especially good for you new players because it's a 3 or 4 star set. So overall, as you can see my stats here, I have fairly high attack. Of course, that's me saying fairly high at my level. For you, it'll be fine if it's like in the triple digits. Crit rate and crit damage, as you can see, I tried to keep it at about half. Energy recharge is really high for mine. Don't worry if you have nothing like this kind of energy recharge. You start at 100%. You just want it to be good enough to be able to use your burst fairly often. And then, of course, I have no animo damage bonus because I don't use the artifact for that. As you can see, though, you might be wondering why I have a resistance here to all the elements. And that is just because in party setup, if you go into elemental resonance here at the top, you can see this here, where it tells you if everyone in your party has a different element, you get this. If you have 2 pyro characters, for example, you get this stat: 2 hydro, 2 animo, electro, dendro, cryo, and geo. If you have 2 party members of the same element, it could also be a good thing to try and take these bonuses into consideration when building your characters. If, for example, you use Animo Traveller, but you also have 2 Dendro characters, then you'd have less reason to build on Elemental Mastery, for example, because you already get a little bonus here for having 2 Dendros. So do try and take that in consideration as well, if you're able to. Now, Constellations, if you're wondering, these are when you get a copy of the same character. So, whenever you wish, if you already had that character, you get a constellation instead of it being a waste. And these constellations simply just mean you get an extra buff. Traveller, as you may be wondering, of course you can't get them from wishing, so instead you get them through exploration or continuing the main story. Now for talents, these are very good to level up. I made the mistake at the beginning of the game to not really worry about the talent leveling up. They are very useful. As you can see here on Amber, I leveled her up for this video, and you can already see a difference in the amount of damage you deal. And also, as you may be wondering, of course you can look at all of the abilities your character does right here. So this is normal attack, this is skill, this is burst, and these two are passive talents that you get. Now, for regular characters, you get 6 here. For Traveller, it's only 5. That's because on most characters, they also get another passive talent. Now, for the 2 you get just below the burst, these are from ascending your characters. I believe it's the 2nd ascension and the 4th ascension, so don't worry. If you don't have these, you probably aren't actually able to level them up to that much yet. Now for Amber, I use the Favonius Warbow. However, another good one you can use on her is actually the Sacrificial Bow. Now personally, I prefer to use the Favonius weapon on Amber, just because her skill of course is that bunny, and there's a delay to when the explosion happens. So personally I tend to prefer the Favonius Warbow, just because I feel like it has a bit more value. If of course you use her skill a lot to distract the enemies, for example, this one is arguably way better to use, of course. So don't always go for what I use. It can be good to try and work out which one's best for yourself. And of course, if you don't have these weapons specifically, many of the 3-star bows are quite good. So this one can be alright. It just means you get more crit damage and weak points, which some enemies have, simply have more damage done. There's also this weapon, which is quite good, especially since opponents affected by Pyro take more damage. And of course, Amber deals Pyro damage. But of course, Elemental Mastery isn't as useful on Amber, just because if, for example, you're using the default team, both Traveller and Lisa tend to have more Elemental Mastery usage to them. This weapon's also quite a solid one. This one's more useful for if you mainly use Amber for your damage, as it requires you to use your normal and charged attacks more, so you can't just be using her skill or burst. However, again, this one simply increases your crit rate. So if you're deciding between these two, for example, the main difference between them is the substat of crit rate or crit damage. So if, for example, your crit rate is quite bad and your crit damage is alright, then it would probably be better to do Slingshot. And then, of course, the opposite for Sharpshooter's Oath. Now for artifacts, if I'm being honest, I didn't really use the sets that were actually best for her. Now, one thing I did forget to mention is if you click down here, it actually says what most people use on this character. So as you can see here, most people use this set, which is quite good if you use her charged attacks. Now for the stats, also, like I said, one thing I forgot to mention is you can also click at the top here to see what main stat most people pick. However, overall, you mainly just want to go a bit like how it was for Traveller, where you just want, you know, crit damage, crit rate, NG recharge, attack percent, that kind of thing. Here I've got Elemental Mastery. For Goblet, higher damage is typically the best one to use. And then for Circlet, again, just either do crit damage or crit rate, depending on which one you need more of. And again, with substats, try and keep it at attack, crit rate, damage, Energy Recharge or Elemental Mastery. Now for Amber, the artifacts I came up with that would be quite good for her. Again, the Exile is very good for getting back her burst. Or Berserker, weirdly enough. Berserker means you get an increased crit rate. This is, of course, if you use the full set at 2 and 4 piece. If you're not using Amber on field that much, in other words, if you're using her skill or burst and then instantly swapping out, you could permanently keep her below a certain health, in this case 70%, meaning you could technically have her permanently at 36% more crit rate. Now for Amber, I didn't really do it too well here, as you can see here I have around 4 times the crit damage as the crit rate. However, of course, it doesn't always have to be perfect. And then energy recharge I have quite high as well, of course. And as you can see here, higher damage from the artifact. For Kaeya, I use the Favonius Sword. However, other good ones are Sacrificial Sword. Now, I wouldn't really recommend the Sacrificial Sword as much as I do for Traveler, just because the thing people use Kaeya for mainly is his burst, so the skill isn't really as necessary. However, of course, using his skill twice would almost definitely get you his burst back, as long as your energy recharge is quite good. So you could argue that as long as you can use this skill instantly again, then there's arguably better use for this than Favonius. And then for 3 stars, I also thought again that Harbinger of Dawn was also just a quite solid one to use on Kaeya. However, I also noticed that there's a weapon that increases damage against opponents affected by Hydra and Cryo. And as you could probably guess, that would be perfect on Kaeya. Now for artifacts, I don't actually have the entire 4-piece on him, so I kind of got a bit lazy, but the set I use for him is this one, where if I had the 4-piece, it would basically mean the crit rate is much higher and I have a cryo damage bonus. However, like a lot of these other characters, the stats you want to go for are typically just, you know, crit rate, crit damage, energy recharge, attack. Not so much elemental mastery for him. Energy recharge is a bit better just because you want to be able to get his burst as often as you can if you're using him as a sub DPS. So yes, as you can see, I have quite good energy recharge for one of these ones, along with crit death rate. And then yeah, I did energy recharge Sands, cryo damage Goblet, and then just crit rate Circlet. And you may have guessed it, the Exile for 3-star artifact. This one is a very good one for him. So overall, if you're trying to think of a good 3-star artifact, the Exile is a very good one. However, of course, you could argue that the Berserker is also quite a good one. And yes, as you can see here, I actually have his crit rate really high with the crit damage not being too much. So you could say I should actually aim for not as much crit rate and more crit damage. However, as you can see here, I have his energy recharge very high. And of course, as you can see here, 61.6% cryo damage bonus. Again, just try and go for high energy recharge. And then for Lisa, I use the Favonius Codex. The Witch Sith is also a good one. It means when you swap to her, you get one of these buffs. And as you can see down here, there's an Elemental Mastery increase, which is usually what she's good for, seeing as the stat that increases from ascending her sometimes is Elemental Mastery. For 3-star artifacts, the Magic Guide is quite good. Substat of Elemental Mastery and increases damage against opponents affected by Electro, which is perfect for her. And also, the Elemental Orb could arguably be good as well, which is the exact same. However, this one's only good if you're using a Hydro character, for example, because of Electro Charged. So for 3-star, I'd say probably go for Magic Guide. But if you don't have one, Emerald Orb is also a quite solid one. I mean, just for the Elemental Mastery alone, it helps her a lot. And for artifact sets, I imagine it's probably Wander's... Oh, it's not. That's a surprise to me. It's Thunder and Fury. Which at the same time I'm not too surprised to hear. It simply just means you do more electro damage and it increases the damage of any electro reaction. So this is a very good set for her. However, of course, I didn't really have much choice of what I could use for her, since I used the fast equip, which is something they recently added, where it gives you your best artifacts to use on them, and then you can just equip them straight away. It's a very handy feature. So again, with the stats, it's usually crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, energy recharge, that kind of thing. So you can see here, elemental mastery, attack, crit damage. If I had the choice, I'd probably do electro damage instead of attack here, or elemental mastery. And as you can probably guess, as it says here, the exile is a pretty good one. However, one that I actually think is better for her is in fact Instructor, which increases her elemental mastery and increases everyone's elemental mastery whenever you get a reaction, meaning causing an elemental reaction gives her 200 elemental mastery. Now, for Noelle, I actually found this weapon to be very good on her, the White Blind. She gets more defense from it, and also even just normal and charged attacks actually give her an increased attack and defense, which is perfect for her. As you may have been wondering, you can look here, skill attributes, and yeah, skill damage goes up from your defense and the amount the shield absorbs. Even the healing you get from it, and even from the burst you get an attack bonus from your defense. So it's very good to build on your defense for her. Now of course you may not have this weapon, so a few other good ones are the Favonius Greatsword. Again, as you may have guessed, it gives you more energy recharge. It's very good if you're mainly using her for her burst. And then for 3-star, this one was the best one I could find. It gives her defense, and of course a little extra thing giving you health after you get kills, but the main part about it is the defense. Now for artifacts, yeah, don't do these ones. I mean, Gladiator's Finale could be good, arguably, because of the Claymore damage bonus at 4-piece. Of course, if you have it, this artifact set is the best on her. Gives her just a bunch of defense, to put it simply. And it's for Geo characters, just basically for her. If you're only really caring about the shield and a few other things, this one can also be a good one. This one can be good as well. You again, plus 30% defense. You could in fact combine that with the other defense artifact, which would be another plus 30% of course, so that would be very good. But of course, this is very good just for a shielder in general. Because you get defense increase and you get even more elemental resistance. And then for stats, of course, you may have guessed it, defense, defense, defense. You could also go for, as people have done, Geo or crit, of course. But personally, I only really cared about defense when building her. And of course, energy recharge. But elemental mastery on a Geo character is usually not useful. All it does is crystallize, and then elemental mastery simply means it can absorb more of that damage, at least to my knowledge anyway. But overall it's not really that good. Crystallize is literally the worst reaction. I really haven't bothered about these stats at all. But if you really are trying to build her, of course, try and go for better stuff than this. So, you know, more crit rate in this situation, ideally like around 30%. And then maybe 150% energy recharge or so. However, of course, as you can see, my defense is very high. For Lynette, I use the Favonius Sword. I'm sure all of you understand what the Favonius and Sacrificial weapons are at this point. As you may have guessed, Sacrificial is also very good on her. It is arguably better than Favonius for her, to be honest. The difference isn't really that big, to be honest. It's just difference of whether you want to use her skill often. And also there is a gamble to using this one, of course, because you're not always guaranteed this one. Whereas if you had this refinement rank 5, this is actually 100% chance if you get crit hits. And then for 3-star weapons, I was having a look, and I feel like this is actually her best 3-star weapon, because you got energy recharge, and using her elemental burst means she gets an attack and movement speed increase. Now, movement speed may not sound all that good in combat, you know, because the best time to get movement speed will probably be when you're trying to travel across the world, right? However, I was thinking her skill does this dash, and that being even faster would make things even stronger. And considering that at refinement rank 5 it's 24%, I'm guessing it's 12% at rank 1. That is quite a significant increase, I'd say. Then for artifacts, I'd say Viridescent Venera is probably her best, as people put here, yeah. Elemental Mastery is also not a too bad one to try and go for, so with Wander's Troop here. Just because she's a sub DPS who does a lot of reactions. And so for stats, it's just, again, NG recharge, animo damage, crit. Elemental Mastery if you want instead, or if you don't have the choice. Attack percent isn't really as useful. As you can probably guess, Exile is great on her. But I also found Gambler very good indeed. Elemental skill damage increase, and 100% chance to get your skill back straight away after you kill an opponent. Meaning, if you use her skill a lot, which, if you're wondering, actually does quite a bit of damage, and of course you go really fast, it's very useful for getting to enemies. This is very good for you, if you do that. I've crit rate about 20% less compared to what's ideal for the crit damage. And then NG recharge is high, because that's my main focus, the burst. And then of course, quite high anime damage bonus here. For Collei, I use Sacrificial Bow, just because her boomerang thing has been very useful. I got to use her skill quite often. However, of course, Favonius Bow is also a good one. Now, a similar thing with Amber, it's the same kind of weapons you want to use, just any of these 3-star bows, just depending on the situation. Of course, this one's not as good on Collei as it is on Amber, because this one's damage affected by Hydro or Pyro. You could also then argue if you already had enemies affected by those stuff, and then did that. But overall, it's usually better to use either sharpshooters or slingshot. For artifacts, yeah, again, it's just random stuff that I used. But yeah, as I suspected, Deepwoods is the one most people use. And that is simply just because of the Dendro bonuses. But again, for stats, I think you all know like how this works from what I've been saying. But it's like, you know, energy recharge, attack, crit damage. This one could probably be better as Dendro damage. Yeah, as most people do. Yeah, crits, attack. Oh, attack, that's interesting. But, you know, just any of these kind of things. And again, just try and get those kind of substats on characters. For her set, Exile, as you probably guessed, or Berserker. Because, like I said with Amber earlier, this one's actually quite good if you're not using them that much, because you could keep them permanently at a low health to get that increased crit rate. But overall, as you can see, this one I actually had a bit more balanced with the crits. High energy recharge, quite good attack. But overall again, yeah, just energy recharge is one of the main things with these characters. And Barbara, I use the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Now this one is the best on her. That's the absolute best one on her. Like even if you have 5-star weapons, unless you're going for like some kind of DPS Barbara, this is the one to go for. There is no better weapon than this for her if you just use her as a healer, because it gives her health bonus, and when you switch to a different character, their attack gets increased. This would probably be 24% at rank 1. And so that's why I can't really give any better weapon suggestion for her. Because if you have any catalysts that aren't just, you know, 1 or 2 stars for her, you likely have this one. You very likely do. If not, you might just have to wait to get something better. And then for artifacts, as always, you probably won't have this set, but this one basically just means healing's far better. Another good 5-star artifact set, however, is arguably the Ocean Hued Clam, which also gives you healing bonus. But if you want a bit of extra damage from healing, this absolute SA basically means that you do some more damage every time your characters heal, which if you're wondering is actually quite good, especially if you use this on a character like Chi-Chi, if you have her. It is very good indeed. I remember getting like about 15,000 damage whenever she'd be healing. That's just extra damage on top of everything else I'm doing. Again, another thing you could do is combine them, so this would be character healing 15% on top of this 15% here. That could give you, you know, just even more healing. And then for stats, you may have guessed it, all health, and possibly healing bonus if you have it on Circlet. And then, if you want to get into some specific things, you could also go for of course, NG Recharge, and maybe Elemental Mastery, if you also sometimes gets hydro application on the enemies. But overall, you don't really have to worry too much on what you're using on her, as long as you get health in all the artifacts, which I failed to do in this one apparently. And then for 3-star artifacts, this one's very good. As you can see here, healing's increased, and using her burst gives even more health back. Which, if you're wondering, yeah, Barbara's burst just does a big heal to all of your members in the party. Now, I was actually thinking about this, and technically this one, just on its own, is also very good. Now, this one is 4-star, unfortunately. However, it's only one thing. And this means that you're not you're affected by cryo for far less time. Now, you may be wondering why on earth would it be cryo of all things? And it's because when you use Barbara's skill, your character is constantly affected by Hydra because of it. Meaning any enemies hit you with cryo, freeze you straight away. Now, of course, technically this would ideally then be used on all the characters you use. However, if you just use it on the character that constantly gets frozen because of using the skill, then that would actually help you a lot. Because, unless I'm mistaken, it means you're frozen for less time. So it would really help you against annoying things that happen. And then, of course, for stats, as you can see here, I haven't worked on crit here at all. My crit damage is literally what you get by default. I've got a healing bonus here though. Energy recharge here is almost default. So yeah, as you can probably tell, the only things that aren't default are just healing bonus and max health. I forgot Barbara sings so much. Now, for Xiangling, because for some reason I completely forgot to go through her earlier, her best weapon for 4-star is this one. However, of course, none of you will have it. I'm not going to say why, but if you're new to this game, you will not have this weapon, okay? So, quite a good one is this one. I mean, you don't really need Elemental Mastery too much. Energy Recharge would probably be better. However, it does give you a bonus against opponents affected by Pyro. But a good 3-star weapon is the White Tassel. Of course, the normal attack damage here, you're not really going to be using. If you play Xiangling as a sub DPS, you're not going to be using that. However, the crit rate is a solid one to have early game. Now for artifacts, don't do these ones. I only have these ones because like they're the best stats I could just use. Okay, now that I look at the stats, they are not the ones you want to really go for. But if you have it, this set is by far the best one, the emblem. As you can see here, yeah, Energy Recharge is the best. Pyro damage is probably the best one for this, yeah. And I'm guessing either crit rate or crit damage. Yeah, so just try and go for, you know, Energy Recharge, crit rate, crit damage, all of that kind of stuff again. Elemental Mastery isn't as needed on her. If you have the option over that or attack, maybe just go for attack, to be honest. Another set that's good, like 4 or 5 stars, is Noblesse Oblige, because her burst is the thing that makes her really good. And as you can see here, it's literally 4 using bursts. And surprise, surprise, one of the good 3-star artifacts is the Exile for the energy recharge. However, another good one I found was if you do 2-piece for Exile, so energy recharge, on top of an artifact set that I somehow don't have, of Scholar, that's another energy recharge. That'll give you plus 40% in energy recharge. So that's a very good one, considering you want that burst on Xiangling constantly. It's now time to show how all these characters work and how they work as a team. So, I thought the best way to show it was by going to the Spiral Abyss. Now, I did notice one thing though, that my Lisa was one ascension away from getting a passive talent. So before I did it, I decided to first of all get all the berries I needed to ascend her. And with that out of the way, I could finally go to Spiral Abyss. Now there was one problem. These enemies were literally destroyed just when we walk into them. So I decided to redo it, but of course, take off every artifact. And as you can see here, all of their stats were suddenly quite bad. However, there was still a bit of a problem. The enemies were still easy to kill, so I decided to take it one step further and also give every character the 1-star weapons, so that the only advantage I had was the fact that the characters themselves were leveled up. So with that out of the way, here's my actual attempt at a Spar Abyss with just the 4 starter characters. Now to start it off, I always go for Amber's skill, and then usually Kaeya's or Lisa's based on what element the enemy is. But overall, the main thing you want to go for, as you can see here, is just to have multiple elements going on at once, so you can cause multiple reactions. Now for Chamber 2, the enemies are just hilly chills, meaning I just went for any ability. But overall, main thing you want to do is to make sure you switch in between every character quite often, and just consider what time to use their abilities.
Freeze! Oh, so sorry.
Let it rain.
Freeze!
Windblade.
Now for this, instead of it being under timed conditions, you simply just have to protect this thing in the middle. So luckily I don't have to worry too much about having to kill the enemies quick enough. Instead I use the fact that ground here is actually wet, meaning that I can constantly freeze the enemies with Kaeya.
Frostbite! Freeze!
No escape.
Dodge this!
Now here, for example, is a good use of the Traveler's Tornado, where you bunch up all the enemies together. Also, another thing you may have noticed me do is for Kaeya here, for example, I use this skill and then the burst, even though I've already got the burst ready. And that is because if you use the burst straight after using the skill, you can usually get the particles just after you use the burst, or rather until it's ready to be recharged. Now here I unfortunately get trapped in the bubble quite a few times. As you can see here, this mage has the number 3 on it, and that number shows how much more damage your skill will do if you hold it instead. Now here, even though quite a lot of the enemies are pyro, I still used Amber's skill just to lure the enemies into the area where I have Lisa's burst active. Here of course I use the burst because it groups all the enemies together again. And while those enemies are taking damage, I can then go for the enemies that aren't being attacked by that burst. Here's an awkward one because all these slimes are different elements. But as you can see here, I was lucky enough to be able to use Amber's burst on all the slimes that weren't the pyro one.
Dodge this!
So the general idea I go for here is I try and get as many enemies together with Amber's skill to get them attacking the Farron Bunny. And then for the enemies that weren't affected by it, I then single them out. And if I have Traveler's Burst ready, I can then just use the burst to get them all together. So this is just the general idea you want to go for, assuming you're using these characters for the same reasons I use them.
Cool it! This moment will be frozen in time.
Now here's a nice little thing to know about those rune gods. If you hit that weak point with a bow character twice, it in fact actually knocks them down like that, where they're not able to move for quite a while. So if you're ever stuck against a rune guard and use a bow character, try and remember to do that, because that can really help you. Don't forget to switch between characters, because I've seen so many new players kind of forget about half of their characters like while they're fighting against tough enemies. And I'm sure I also did that at the beginning as well, but it's something you should really get into the habit of doing, where you just constantly switch between characters. As you can see here, Anemo, Hydro damage and then Pyro damage along with Cryo at the end, all from using the skills and bursts in the right order. Now, a nice little tactic you can have with Lisa for the monolith, for any kind of monolith you have to protect. As you can see here, if you use her burst, it will literally just defend it for you. Of course, it's not infinite, but it does actually protect it for quite a while. Here I targeted the ones that still had their shield on, because as you could see the other one was taking a lot of damage. And then I left one of them with the Baron Bunny, and then attacked the one who I broke the shield of earlier. And then after killing off one of them, I then went back to the other one, of course. Now, at this point, for those who haven't got her yet, you'd have Collei unlocked. So after that, you actually have to have 2 teams. Now, conveniently enough, I've gone through 9 characters so far, so I simply just had to pick 4 of them. As you may have noticed in this team, every burst from the character, apart from Barbara, actually lasts for quite a while, a bit like Kaeya. Now, another problem is, of course, I forgot to remove the weapons and artifacts off those characters. So I'm using a fully built team, and then the starter characters who literally just have the default stuff equipped. Now, one thing I actually didn't know is that Lynette's burst, as you can see, actually gets enemies distracted, similar to Amber's skill. One other thing useful about Lynette's burst is actually, as you may have noticed, it can do more than just animo damage. If it combines with another element, it does animo damage and also a bit of that element damage it combined with, which is another reason why I think Lynette is a very good character. Now here, it gets a bit more awkward for the floors, because as you can see here, the enemies were already affected by Pyro, and after quite a while, I managed to actually finally beat the enemies. The complete opposite happened for the other team, where they got absolutely evaporated, and it was already back to the other team straight away. Something I forgot to mention before is that if you use Traveller's Burst, for example, and Amber's skill is within the tornado's area, you can actually get it to be carried by it, meaning that by the time the tornado ends, Amber's skill will likely then also explode, which was especially good in this situation because, as you may have noticed, the tornado was already affected by cryo, meaning when the tornado ends, you have enemies affected by cryo, and then Amber's skill would then have caused melt. Now that thing exploding is something you get in domains sometimes. It's a bit of a pain to deal with. It's this ball of fire that just follows you about and it explodes. There's nothing you can really do about it. You just have to try and avoid it as much as you can. And with that, I had finished floor 5. Did you really think I was gonna finish there? No, I wanted to test my limits. So naturally, I skipped to floor 9. Now here is something very good. I used Lynette's burst, Collei's burst, and then Xiangling's skill, meaning they're constantly taking tons of damage. And luckily enough, Lynette's burst was actually affected by Hydro, meaning I was getting all the 4 elements of my party members being constantly dealt. Here again, I do a similar thing. This is exactly why, after doing this, I'd say this is actually a very good team if you have all of these characters. And then for the other team, I did bring back their artifacts and weapons, so don't worry, I'm not doing this with Dull Blade Traveller. Now, a main thing to note about Traveller is right here. The burst doesn't carry the heavier enemies, so here, you want to do what I did here, where you instead go for the bigger enemy while the smaller ones are being carried away by the tornado. Now for the next chamber, I noticed all these enemies were Hydra and Cryo. So I thought to get the blooms out with reacting to Hydra. And then afterwards use Xiangling's abilities to then cause Burgeon. Which for those wondering is when you set fire to the Dendro cores. And as you can probably guess, the key here for killing these enemies is with Xiangling and Lynette. Now here is very awkward. All of the enemies are split up, and using Collei's burst here for example, only got 1 enemy in there. So here I wanted Lynette's burst to try and distract all the enemies, so I could then try and get them if they were together. But overall in a situation like this, where all the enemies are split up like that, you just want to go for each enemy individually, to be honest. If you have Animo Traveller in this situation, for example, that's great, because you can get them all together, or any other character that can group enemies like that. But if you don't have anything like that, to be honest, you just want to fight every enemy separately. Whether you go for the strongest enemy or the weakest enemy first, I don't really know if that matters too much, to be honest. If you want to risk getting hurt too many times, then it's probably best to go for the weaker enemies first. But overall, it'll probably still take them the same amount of time, roughly. Now here, it kind of got awkward because I noticed how low on health my Lisa was. And of course, apart from Kaeya, Lisa was my next best character to use against pyro enemies. So I had to be really careful here and simply just use Lisa for her burst and not risk using her skill. Now here was also good timing. I used the burst to also avoid taking damage from that pyro slime explosion. And while that enemy was affected by Kaeya, then did Amber's burst as always. And then, as you'd have probably guessed, I used Traveler's Burst to try and get enemies together. Unfortunately, it didn't really work. And then for the final chamber, I used the same tactic as always, just trying to get bloom reactions and then possibly Burgeon after the bloom. Now, this enemy right here is an absolute pain to deal with. However, they were affected by Hydro thanks to that thing in the middle. So I went for Burgeon reactions again. Then finally, I made it to the second half. Now, I was in a sticky situation here. My Traveler had just died. So I used Kaeya's abilities to try and affect them since they're affected by Pyro. And then Amber died as well. And then I remembered, it's kind of stupid to try and do this. So I thought, you know what, screw it. And that is it. I really hope this cleared up any problems you may have had regarding combat. Now, as you can probably tell, I didn't really do much research into any of this. So if after watching this, there are still things you don't understand, or maybe even if you already knew this stuff and you think I was wrong in some way, please do let me know in the comments. I mean, after all, most of the characters I discussed were ones I had hardly ever used before. And also, of course, if there's anything else you want me to do a guide on, whether it's for Genshin or maybe for another game that you've seen me play on this channel, do let me know. Now, after this point in the video, I have just returned from watching the 4.5 special program, and I just found out that when 4.5 comes out, they're literally adding a feature where it tells you what kind of things to level up to make your character stronger. Kind of feels a bit pointless now making this video, not gonna lie. So I hope that at the very least the whole combat as a team kind of makes more sense now after watching this video. And of course, as always, thank you all for watching this, and I'll see you on the next one. Actually, one other thing before I finish this video. Let's have a look back at one of my videos. That's the end of the video. Now, I don't normally say this, but this video took me a very long time. 160? What is this? Amateur hour?